Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 8, Non-infectious disease and disorders. This is video number 13 on epidemiology and environmental disease. This is kind of a follow-on from the previous video where instead of using our epidemiological studies to focus on nutritional diseases, we're going to look at some of the diseases caused by environmental exposure. As we looked at previously, the key here is for you to start looking at data and start to identify trends, develop a little story, see if you can explain what you're seeing and suggest potential links and also potential interventions or treatments, public health campaigns that could potentially be used to counter some of the statistics that you're seeing in the data that you're presented with. So what are some of the diseases associated with environmental exposure? Well, probably one of the key ones is cardiovascular disease. As we've talked about previously, some of these kind of general lifestyle diseases have increased in their prevalence over the years, particularly as we've addressed a lot of areas around good hygiene and good medical practices. So now some of the decisions that we make about our diet, about our exposure to the sun, choices about substances like cigarettes, alcohol or other drugs, our exposure to heavy metals like lead in the environment, asbestos in building materials, all of these have made contributions to the increasing incidence of certain types of environmental diseases. So this is just a very small little checklist for you here of some of the diseases associated with environmental exposure. So mesothelioma is the one that's kind of linked to asbestos. Some of the cardiovascular diseases, particularly things like atherosclerosis, are linked to diet, but then other things like skin cancers, lead poisoning, lung, mouth and throat cancers are really, I guess, more closely linked to either mutagens in the form of radiation, electromagnetic radiation like ultraviolet light, or to chemicals in the environment. Cardiovascular disease is such a big one, not simply related to diet, but also to lifestyle. That's one of the ones that's actually worth having a look at in a little bit more detail. When we look at environmental exposure in epidemiology, then we need to think about what these studies are trying to do. And the key that for each of these is to try and build up these links, potential links between the environmental agent and the incidence of particular disease. So if we see something like atherosclerosis, heart disease, strokes increasing, is there a common denominator or are there a number of common denominators? Are there factors in the environment that we can pinpoint as being contributing factors? Now, there may be genetic links, there may be dietary links, and so that's why these sorts of studies are often quite comprehensive, especially in terms of their demographics, to give us a really good overview of exactly what different factors may be impacting on particular individuals and the incidence of disease. We do know, as I said, that lifestyle-related diseases have been on the rise, especially as our longevity has increased, as we live, our life expectancy is much higher than it used to be, and also our exposure to environmental agents has been relatively high. And so therefore, until we've addressed some of those problems and tried to bring down the levels of ultraviolet radiation that we're exposed to, or chemicals that we're exposed to, smokes, in particular, and smoke obviously isn't something that's simply related to cigarettes. It's also related to things like bushfires and the natural kind of disasters that can happen that will again fill the atmosphere with certain types of chemicals that can be quite harmful to humans. So what are you doing with these epidemiological studies? Well, hopefully from the last time when you were focusing in on some of the nutritional diseases, you're looking for trends. What trends can you see? Are lines going up or are they coming down? Are they leveling out? Is there a similarity between males and females, or are there differences? Is there a similarity between different age groups, or are there differences? What do you think are the possible causes of those trends? What's behind the data? What can we see? Is there anything that we can use to explain some of the trends that we're identifying? And sometimes you might also find strategies that have been put in place or particular factors that have contributed, maybe causal factors, to the higher incidence or increasing incidence of certain types of diseases. So this is part of why we do these analyses, in order to try and get at this sort of data. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare has a lot of information about the health of Australians, and one of those interesting ones that we can have a look at are the patterns and trends associated with death. Now, that's maybe a bit of a negative topic to be talking to you about, except for the fact that you can see that in terms of deaths per 100,000 of the population, don't forget our population from 1909 to 2019 grew substantially, and yet the number of deaths per head of the population has substantially decreased. These are quite significant decreases, and the decreases have occurred for both males and females. So some of what we're looking at here, and you can see a level of parallel between these two lines. The patterns are quite similar at the same sort of years. So we can see that whatever it is that we're doing, we are actually reducing the death rate. So sometimes when we start looking at these kind of age standardized death rates, then we want to say, okay, well, with this we see a really nice downtrend here. So this is a really good downtrend. Make sure that you are relating the two variables to each other when you're analysing these trends. So there is a significant decrease in the number of deaths per 100,000 members of the population over the years 1909 to 2019. Try when you're analysing graphs to be as specific as you can and pull those two variables, the dependent and independent variables, together when you're stating your trend. But then if we start to have a look at some of these patterns, you can see circulatory diseases, one I sort of mentioned a little bit earlier in this video. This is this graph here, this one here. And pleasingly, the incidence of these sorts of diseases has massively dropped. In fact, it's been dropping since about 1975, and it's coming way, way down. But for a very large period of time, over that 100-year span in which this data appears, you can see that they've dominated. Circulatory diseases have dominated. Now, it could well be that, everybody dies because their heart stops. And so that's partly, I guess, a link there to a circulatory disease. But there does seem to be some specific types of diseases that have, been closely associated with circulatory diseases. And that can include things like atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries or plaque in the arteries, as well as myocardial infarctions, heart attacks, and strokes. And so some of these are really, it's when you start to pick apart some of these individual figures that you start to see some patterns emerging that you might want to explain. So I can see there's this particular graph here is on a slight upswing. It's only recently started to turn back down. So from 1909, they don't look significantly different. It's almost horizontal, but there's a slight grade in that going up. And that's this one. That's cancers. So there has been actually a slight increase in per capita, so per 100,000 of the population, deaths associated with cancers. And so, and then there's probably a slight tailing off at the end over here. So these are the sorts of graphs that we would expect you to be able to look at. We want you to describe the trend, so what's happening with this data. We want you to see if you can explain the trend. Can you see some of the reasons for these sorts of drops? This is a really interesting one here, which is our infectious disease. And again, I'm talking to you in a time of COVID, so that's probably going to have a little blip around these years of 2020, 2021, where we know there's been some deaths associated with COVID. And this is why we look at this data. This This is a definite downtrend. We can definitely see over the last 100 years, infectious disease or deaths associated with infectious disease has dropped from, say, about 300 deaths per 100,000 of the population in 1900s, early 1900s, to virtually none, a very, very small number of people who are actually dying from infectious disease. So that's one of the things that's made COVID such an interesting situation for us, such a novel situation for us, because we haven't had many deaths from infectious disease. It's a new thing that we're all trying to deal with, to understand. So these are the sorts of questions that hopefully will spring to your mind when you're looking at this sort of data, when you're trying to analyze especially the sorts of lifestyle changes, lifestyle attitudes, behaviors that can contribute to certain types of disease, and what it is that we can actually do about these. And that's the key to this sort of data, is once we have a look at it, what can we do about it? But that's something that we'll have a look at as we analyse some more of these graphs during class time. Thanks for watching.